All right. Well, I am going to yield the floor to Stephen Self, who I'm sure will have a brilliant presentation. And, feel free to pipe up and ask questions. And I'm just going to say, let's see what Stephen has to say.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Amy, for asking me. I don't think of myself as an expert in any kind of sense of the word, but I am an enthusiast. So what I thought I might do is just share a little bit about my approach to genealogy, what it's meant to me, and some tips and hints toward the end. But mostly what I want to do is talk about family stories that I've been able to discover. Because what I want to emphasize is that personal history is also history. It connects to the things that have been going on around us. And I'm always fascinated when I find out that, oh, my grandmother always said that the Adkinses always voted Republican. And when I asked why, she said, because we lived down the road in Illinois from Mr. Lincoln's parents. And I thought that was just a joke. And then I looked it up on a map, and it was absolutely true. And so that was the reason, that was the whole reason, until she got audited during the Nixon administration, and then she switched to Democratic. But
I'll take this personal.
Exactly. But just have that little connection of knowing that they actually my great-great-grandparents might have met, maybe not Abraham Lincoln, but his stepmother and her husband, things like that. It's kind of amazing to think about. So just finding those little connections about where people lived, why they may have moved, which groups of people moved together, where did people tend to come from, tend to go to, is always a source of fascination for me. So I've got a few sections in this presentation, and we'll stop at different points to answer questions. But if at any point as we're going along you have a question, please feel free to ask. So I'm going to share my screen here if I can do this correctly. Can y'all see that slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, good. And I will try and tie this into spiritual practice as much as possible, but I want to encourage you to think about what family history might mean to you from a spiritual standpoint. How does it connect you to mystery? How does it connect you to other people? And how it can answer questions and raise questions, which, spiritual practice is kind of all about. So be thinking from that mindset, and that might kind of give you some ideas about where to search, and also to maybe look at your own family history in new and unusual ways. So let me go through. Whoops, went too far. So why am I interested in genealogy? I've always been interested in family history, and I was, just like I think it was Karen that mentioned earlier, I was always one sitting at someone's knee listening to the family stories. My brother and sister couldn't be bothered. And I just loved listening to the stories, but what I liked most about it was watching their faces of these people that I cared very deeply about, talking about people that they cared very deeply about, that I would never meet. And that's kind of where genealogy starts. You start with someone who knew someone who knew someone. I was looking the other day and I realized my aunt, who passed away a few years ago, remembers a story that her great-grandmother told her before they moved to Texas. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this great-grandmother, she remembers her grandmother was born in 1790 in Rhode Island, and she knew her. And so I'm thinking, that just is two connections back to someone who was born not that long after the United States was born. And so when you think about it in those contexts, those chains of time and are really not as distant as you might possibly think. So that's how I kind of always got started. My approach to genealogy was. But I've also been very interested in history, U.S. history. So as I mentioned earlier, anytime I can find a connection between my own personal history or my family's history and what is considered history from a textbook standpoint, from what we learn in school, it's always a really, really interesting thing to know. I found out recently that an ancestor of mine named Niles Coleman lived in, I think it was called Whately, Massachusetts. and they heard about the battle in Concord. So they all mustered up and marched over there 2 days after it was all over, and then they walked home. Now, that's not a very exciting story to tell, but it does give you that little tiny little connection that this person heard about this story. They knew about it. They were inspired by it. They wanted to go help, and then they went home, which is, think about all the times that you've made plans and they got changed. So finding those connections between personal history and general history is always really important. I also like the way genealogy reminds us that we're all connected. Especially, I've done a few of the genetic genealogy services, and I'm fascinated by the people that show up as relatives, people I've never heard of. It's helped me connect to people who I really wanted to know who they were, because I knew they were somehow related to me, but I didn't know exactly how. And being able to make those connections as we go through. But when I look at the rainbow of people that these DNA services show are my relatives, it makes me realize, and if you watched shows like Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr., you'll know that those connections are amazing. And so it helps with that idea of seeing yourself in other people. Genealogy kind of reinforces that for you. Also, genealogy can provide some clues to how your family behaves, their approaches to things, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of history, and we'll jump right into that here in a few minutes. And also, I'm the bachelor uncle in my family, right? I'm the gay son, brother, uncle, and cousin who, when I look at these family stories, I see other relatives that had never married, maybe had no children of their own. And I want to make sure that everybody remembers these people. I want them, even in my own head, I want to know you existed, you were there. You're not just a tombstone somewhere out in the middle of Nebraska, but you're someone that acknowledges your existence. So to me, that's kind of important. It's almost like collecting. As Amy mentioned earlier, I'm a librarian by profession. So organizing, creating connections between things is kind of part of what I do. And so this kind of dovetails into that really, really well. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some family stories here. And I told Amy this earlier, I have to apologize. Some of these are a little dark. And to my own self were a little bit shocking. But I thought I would kind of use these stories as ways of enlightening, of approaching family history and thinking about it. So, from sitting at these people's knees and listening to their stories, I always had a need to know. I was always the one that was wanting to ask, and I often got kind of shut down with some of my questions in different kinds of ways. But this is a question I asked my father. I said, your grandma Passmore has lived with the family for a long time. This is my great-grandmother. She always lived with my grandmother, as far as I know. She lived with my grandmother when my dad was a teenager. And I asked, was there ever a grandpa Passmore? Knowing full well that there probably was. But the response I got was, he died a long time ago. Let's talk about something else. That's what my dad said. So he had a clue that there was something going on, but it just wasn't something to be discussed, certainly not in front of my grandparents at all. This is a picture of my great-grandfather Passmore, who I recently found out went to some sort of college or high school that was in San Marcos called the Texas Star Academy or something like that.
Huh.
I don't know if it's not there anymore by any chance. But
Have you found any record of it in the Handbook of Texas? That's usually.
I have. It is an institution that existed. I just don't know if there's any records for it. That's on my list of things to look for.
Oh, darn.
I did find a newspaper article that talked about people who won awards at some sort of a poetry event or something, and he was mentioned as doing something. So, but anyway, so this is my grandfather Passmore. And in digging around a little bit, here's what I found out. My grandmother actually shot him and killed him because he was planning to kill her mother, my grandma Passmore, that lived with the family all those years.
Oh
And
my God, Stephen.
it's pretty dark. And I did not know this story until shortly before my grandmother passed away. But she'd always told me, and that last paragraph has it there, um, she never wanted to answer my questions about genealogy, and except in a very curated way, because she said, you never know what you might find out. And all these years, I knew that all of her aunts and uncles, many aunts and uncles, and her sisters certainly knew this story, and no one ever breathed a word about it. It doesn't really change my opinion of my grandmother so much, but it explains a lot of the family dynamics of how everyone walked on eggshells around her, and how my great-grandmother felt a certain loyalty to her because she almost felt as if her daughter had saved her life. So the story was she was courting one of the hired hands. He shot him, and then she shot her father. So that was the story. Once I started looking, and this is, of course, when I found out about the story, this was before you could actually go out and find newspaper articles on the internet. Now I go and search, and this was a wire story that ran nationally.
Wow.
Double murder in what's it, Wilson County? Wilson County, yeah. So anyway, so a simple question that I had at the beginning turned into something a lot bigger. I've had cousins approach me, second cousins, their grandmothers were also one of my grandmother's sisters, saying, I need to talk to you about Aunt Inez at some point. And I know what they're getting at, but we've never had those conversations. And when Amy said this was going to be recorded and go into an archive, I went, oh, okay, well, I guess the cat's out of the bag.
Well, it's a church archive. We'll have to have a password.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's one story. So I don't know much about him, except that apparently he had, either it was a mental illness, someone said he might have had a stroke, but that he was actually had a complete personality change and started stomping around the farm with a gun looking for people to shoot. And so that's what happened. So another question I had from a need to know standpoint was to talk to my grandfather. This would be the wife of my grandmother who shot her father. I said, Papa, you talk all the time about your father, but what was your mother like? He very rarely talked about her. And when he did, he would just say, she was mean. That's all you need to know. So this is my great grandmother, Georgia Ola Caraway. But what I know about her is that she was one of 17 children. I think she was number 13. Throughout her life, she was a very active member of a primitive Baptist congregation in Gonzales County that my grandmother, who very derisively referred to as foot-washing Baptists, is the way she put it. But she was also a nurse in Nixon, Texas, and she was trained by the local physician. She didn't go to school to be a nurse or anything like that. The local physician had a little 8-bed hospital, and he needed a nurse and asked if she would do it, and she said yes. And at a family reunion on my grandmother's side of the family, this is my grandfather's, but on my grandmother's side of the family, I was kind of just talking a little bit about my great-grandparents and how I did not know much about my great-grandmother. And a cousin of my grandmother said, your nanny self saved my husband's life when he was born. She was the kind of a midwife, and she said he was very small and weak, and she was very worried. Her parents were very worried that he was not going to survive. And so Mrs. Self came over and took him, and she rocked him and cradled him and made sure that his airways were clear and all that kind of stuff. She said basically held him for 2 days while we were just trying to deal with all the other issues that were going on. And she was very convinced that my great-grandmother had saved his life. So from my grandfather, I just hear that she's mean. And from other people, I get a much, much different story. So that's a lesson to learn, is that what you think you might know about somebody may not actually be the truth. I have no idea what the issue between my great-grandmother and her son was, But I do know that when he was a teenager, he walked across the church, walked across the corner from the Baptist church in Nixon and decided to become a Methodist. Like that. So that might have had something to do with it. Let's see. Another story. This is on my mother's side of the family. This is my great-great-grandmother. And I should actually fix that slide. I said, Mom, you said your great-grandmother's brothers and sisters all grew up in different homes. She would mention that every once in a while, that their parents had died young and that all the kids were split up. They were a very devout Church of Christ. They lived in East Texas. And I would ask about that, and my mom was always kind of cagey about it. But we were at a family reunion when I brought it up one time, and my great aunt Joanne, who would have been the granddaughter of this woman, and is the only person in my grandmother's generation that's still alive, said, I think we can tell that story now. Around 1900, this great-great-grandmother had an episode where she kind of snapped. And the story that I can read from the court records is she tried to take her youngest baby and throw it in a bayou near Houston. And she was kind of apprehended, and her husband had her committed. I don't think he told the truth in his, for reasons for her being committed. He claimed that her parents were related to each other, and that's why she was insane. But I can find absolutely no evidence of that. But she was sent to the state hospital in San Antonio. And about a year later, he died. And they had about a dozen kids, some of his from a previous marriage and their own children together. And they were all farmed out to different Church of Christ ministers' families. So they kind of grew up in these different families. My great-grandmother was about 14 at the time, and she kind of ended up being a maid in a household for a Church of Christ pastor. And then over the years, a few of the older kids that could write kept up with each other, but they lost track of some of the younger kids because the preachers would move around from town to town. But slowly over time, they kind of got in touch with them. One story that my grandmother told was that her grandmother was at a Church of Christ, like ladies retreat in East Texas, and she was telling the story of her mother and how they were all kind of dispersed. And she says, that sounds just like a neighbor of mine. And they went over to her house, and it was her sister.
Cool.
Just by chance. That was
Wow.
what had happened. Well, then they thought one of the older sisters got in touch. This was like in the 1930s. They called the state hospital in San Antonio and said, we would like to visit our mother's grave. And they went through their records and they said, well, we moved her to Austin in 1920. So they called Austin. The Austin State Hospital said, we moved her to Wichita Falls in 1924. And so they called the state hospital in Wichita Falls and they said, would you like to come visit her? She was still alive this whole time. Nobody knew where she was. Everyone had lost track of her. And interestingly, the obituaries for her brothers and sisters and her parents don't mention her at all. It's as if she never existed. But she was in the state hospital system for about 43 years.
Wow.
Well over half her life. And what probably started out as just postpartum depression certainly did not get any better when she was institutionalized for that time period. So this is a little picture of the you can see it says Southwestern Insane Asylum. That's Emily C. Catherine Armstrong right there. When she got married at the age of 20, she already had 4 stepchildren, and then she had 9 of her own. So it's a total of 13 kids in the family. And that's her tombstone right there, which I got to visit one time. I went to the state hospital and asked for records, and they looked up her name, and they said, this is where her number is. Now, one of the things that they will absolutely allow you to do is if you want to put a tombstone there that has name and date, you are certainly welcome to. And one of my goals with some cousins of mine, I want to talk to my Aunt Joanne about it since this is her grandmother, but something that actually has her name on it, because it's a very, very sad looking cemetery. You may have seen the one in Austin that's near the state hospital, is it off North Loop, I think maybe?
I don't know.
It's very similar. It's a very open field, and you see just 2 or 3 tombstones. But if you walk through it, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of these little numbers because of the stigma associated to it. And that's a picture of my great-great-grandmother with 3 of her daughters. I don't think any of those are my great-grandmother, but they did go up to visit her several times. And I rode off to the state for a packet, and they sent me a packet this fat that had medical records, records of visitation once the family actually found her again, and all kinds, and the actual court transcription from 1900 when she was committed. All very interested. And just on my say-so, I said, I'm her great-great-grandson. They said, okay, that was good enough for them, and they sent it to me. And I'm kind of amazed those records were actually kept in a file somewhere. They were still available. So before we go on to the next one, I'll just stay right there. If you have any questions about how maybe I went about some of the research on this, most of this, though, was just listening to family stories and then trying to look at what kind of evidence might tell me something different. In some cases, it was other stories that contradicted the first one. And in cases like that, I don't know, it's difficult to think about. What is the truth?
Stephen, would you tell us again how you found her medical records? My husband's great-grandmother was committed to an institution in Fort Worth, and you've got me thinking maybe they have records. Would you tell us again how you got to your great-grandmother's records?
Oh, I think he's frozen. I'm going to text him. Oh, there he is.
So did I pop out for a second?
Yeah, you're frozen for briefly.
Yeah, sorry about that. I keep getting this notice that my connection is unstable. But does anybody have any questions or maybe similar stories that they might?
Did you hear Karen?
I don't know if you heard my question.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't.
My husband's great-grandmother or great-great-grandmother, I forget which, was committed to an institution in Fort Worth for melancholia and died there. She was only there 2 or 3 years. Your story of getting your ancestors' records is very interesting to me. Would you mind repeating how you got those hospital records? Because I'm thinking maybe I'll go after some in our own family.
Well, what I might do is I'll email more details of who I wrote. I've still got the envelope with the address on it. This was like
That would be
probably in the late
wonderful.
90s that I wrote this letter, but it's the State Department of Health Services.
Okay.
And if you look and see, they might have like a records division,
Okay.
and you could probably just make the phone call now. I think if I remember right, I called over there and they said, just write a letter with what you would like, and then we will get it to you. And I remember it taking quite a while, and I was actually surprised that anything ever actually showed up. And the fact that they actually, I mean, it must have cost them $10 to photocopy all the stuff they mailed to me. But yeah, definitely I would get a hold of them. If I get the actual address, I don't know if actually the address would be still valid either. But
That's okay. I'm sure I'll go after the State Department of Health Services. That's a good.
They're the ones that would have those records if they still do. And if my great grandmothers were digitized, so they weren't digitized, they were microfilmed. So it was very easy for them. They had a file. They just went to the microfilm, copied it all off, and sent it to you. And they might charge for it, but I was willing to pay just so I could find out something about her. I thought it was very interesting, her picture from the previous screen. That's when she's, before she had her last child or two, but she still looks very world weary in my own mind. And here, she really didn't know a whole lot of what was going on. My grandmother said that when she went one time, she actually had a doll that she kept all the time. And she remembered that she had a son. And she actually had 2 sons, but that's all she could remember. She didn't remember having any daughters.
Wow.
Even though she had 7 of them.
Stephen,
But amazingly, they did all find each other I've got pictures of them after they found all each other, after all those years, which is really surprising. They were never particularly close, but they always made sure that they stayed in touch after that.
Penny, you had a comment?
It's interesting that, and you said she was committed in 1900, that it was called the Southwestern Insane Asylum. And I'm thinking that nomenclature changed at some point where we didn't still call them insane asylums.
Exactly. If you can find old postcards for it in San Antonio, the building itself, it was considered very state of the art, I think, at the time. But the story I heard was that I think they put her on a train to San Antonio. And then my great-great-grandfather lived maybe a year beyond that. I don't know much about him either, other than the fact that certain branches of the family worshipped his service in the Civil War. I believe he was at Gettysburg, although I'm not entirely sure. His unit was there, but he's not on the list. So, that's another question.
Did you ever find out why they moved her from place to place?
I think it was just a question of space.
Oh.
I think, she wasn't improving at all. The story I think I heard from San Antonio to Austin was definitely a space issue. I'm not sure why she got moved up to Wichita Falls. But at some point in the record, they said, we don't know who to contact about her anymore. Once they found family, they would send every 6 months, they'd send a letter. Your mother has not improved, blah, blah, blah. But they had no idea who to write to after her husband died. They had no idea who to actually report to. And so, he was in Houston, she was north of Houston, and she was in San Antonio, and that was 1901. It just all broke down at that point, and she was basically just a word of the state from that on, with no visitors and no one knowing that she was still alive.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your story about, I guess it's your great-grandfather who tried to shoot his wife, is really fascinating, because my great-great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother, my mother's grandfather, we don't have a real clear story, but she divorced her husband after he accused her of having children with someone else. And as best I can recall about the story, it was she held a gun on him to make him leave the house. And the assumption is that he may have been the person who had bipolar disorder. And I'm not 100% clear on what happened to him after. My brother is sure he went back to his family, and I'm like, I don't think so. And I don't know. We don't have very many pictures of him, but there is that very similar kind of story. And one does wonder, well, what happened? Was it a stroke? Was it, infection? What was it? That
right.
sort of figured that.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. But the other thing in my research on the Embry family, talking about being a gay son, this one young man in the diaries, her son, she kept calling him a girlish boy, and he liked his bunnies and he liked his kittens, which was, code. And I came across a couple of pictures of him, and then he went to New York, and I came across a really beautiful, he was an actor, and he was dressed up in a Shakespearean outfit, and he was an actor. And I had the hardest time finding him in the census, because it turned out that his name, and this would be a phonetic, how something would be pronounced, the name Embry was written down as Ambry. But he was living with a milliner, an older gentleman who was a milliner, which sort of seems like a gay kind of job.
Yeah.
And that guy was from England. Huh. And so he would have pronounced it that way, right? Ambry, and then when I met the family, they were like, oh, we kind of thought that. We have this picture of this. And they had this story that he was a count and all this kind of, a very big fabrication. But they still had his ring. So wow. Even though they knew he was gay, it was this really beautiful story about well, we kept him anyway. We kept him in the family, and we kind of always thought, but we didn't, know for sure. And I was like, no, he's living with this guy in New York City.
Wow. That's so
And it was
interesting.
great. It was just a great thing to sort of like discover that.
Well, sure. Wow. Well, yeah. So a lot of this just points out that what you think you know is not always what you know, and or what is closer to the truth. And I guess the point is you gather documentary evidence as much as possible to help create the stories. And if the documentary evidence contradicts the stories, sometimes the documentary evidence is wrong, sometimes it's right. And I'll mention this later, but being right is not the goal of genealogy. It's uncovering as much as you can so that more stories can be told.
There's a really great book that I always recommend. It's called Black Sheep and Kissing Cousins, What Family Stories Tell Us. And it talks about the themes of family stories, how the story might be different than the genealogy and what that makes you think about your family. And I just love that book. It's such a great book.
Oh, I'm going to look that up for sure. Well, let me move on to the next section. And I was telling Amy, I kind of created these categories after I started digging up the stuff that I thought was interesting. And so although the theme of this is genealogy is spirituality. And, just because I've got ministers in my background doesn't make them any more spiritual than anybody else. But I do think that their stories are kind of interesting in telling the story about religious denominations in America. I will tell this one funny story before I get launched into that. I was actually baptized EUB. Does anybody here know what EUB means?
Evangelical United Brethren.
Very good, very good.
Before 1967 then.
That's right. It was 1965. Yes, my mom grew up in an EUB church in Lissy, Texas, between Eagle Lake and East Bernard, just kind of southwest of Houston. And there were not very many EUB churches in Texas. Mom used to talk about going to EUB youth camp, and it was either in Texas or Oklahoma, and there was like maybe 10 churches between the two states that would send kids to these things. But my grandmother, after the Union in 1968, was always threatening to carry around a can of spray paint in her purse whenever she went by an old Methodist church that just said Methodist Church on it, so she could spray paint the word United on it. which I thought was always really funny. I didn't include that in here with a slide, but I wanted to tell that story. So here are just some people in my background that are had ministry experience. This is the Reverend William. Hold on, I got to move my little bar here because I can't see it. Reverend William Hamlin. He was my fourth great granduncle. Now, sometimes you can say fifth great uncle or fourth great granduncle. I tend to say granduncle when I'm describing things because it puts everyone on the same line. Your grandfather or granduncle, but there's different ways of saying that. But he was born in the Cumberland Gap area, near where Virginia and Tennessee meet. And he was very active in Brown County, Indiana, as a minister. I found out recently that he served in the Mexican-American War. He was sick most of the time, but he did actually spend a lot of time in Mexico during the war. And he originally started with a denomination called the United Brethren in Christ, and that there were a bunch of little schisms in Indiana, apparently, at this time among this group. And he ended up with a group called the Evangelical Republican United Brethren in Christ, which I have no idea what that means, but I thought that was an odd choice of words to mix church and state that way.
It's very specific.
Yes. But in 1870, he did switch to the Methodist Episcopal Church South, for sure. And he was a circuit rider in both denominations, apparently. He had many small churches and would kind of ride around. I thought at one point when I was talking to Amy earlier that he had actually written a hymn. And it turns out it was actually his nephew that wrote the hymn based on what someone remembered from a very famous sermon that he had given. And the sermon ended with the phrase, he would shake his Bible in the air and say, "And God himself the author," which is the refrain of this hymn. So I kind of like pounded it out on the piano, and it's really unsingable and kind of awful. But the words were really actually kind of good. But I thought that was kind of interesting that he had that. So this was Reverend William Hamlin. Now his nephew, my third great granduncle, was the Reverend Isom Wheelis, who was Presbyterian. At some point, they kind of switched over. The family moved to Indiana from Indiana to Iowa for a while, and then he moved on the Oregon Trail to California and Washington and Idaho area. And he also traveled around as a minister quite a bit. But I found through the California Digital Newspapers Project, I plugged his name in there. It's not a very common name, although it's got some odd spellings for sure, and found out that there was actually a small college founded not too far from, it's called San Joaquin College. It was just near Stockton, California. And he was the founding president of this organization. I found out later through another website that there were 3 or 4 colleges founded within the same year by the Presbyterian Church in Northern California. And as you can imagine, they kind of got themselves spread a little thin. Rather doing what Southwestern did and mushed them all together, they all just kind of failed on their own. His particular one burned down. But it was co-ed. It was basically, it looked like it was first grade through college. They had like 5 teachers. So I'm not sure what kind of college it actually was. I was joking with a friend of mine about what's the accreditation process for this institution like. I can't even imagine.
You know, they used to just call schools colleges. That's just kind of what they called them. And like Salado College is in and Baylor College at Independence, and like they weren't really, they were just schools.
Yeah, it was definitely residential.
Yeah,
you did go there and stay there full time.
Right.
Most of the kids were very local.
Kids.
You know, their parents wouldn't have lived more than 20 or 30 miles away, I would imagine. But you could pay tuition in gold, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah, I thought that was kind of neat. And the story, I didn't put it on here on the slide, but that he was actually crossing a creek somewhere near Mount Shasta, and either fell off his horse or just slipped in the creek and he hit his head. And he only lived for a few weeks after that, but he's buried in Spokane, Washington. So they brought him back there either to die or just to be buried. So even though I was born in Washington State, I did not know I had all these cousins in Washington State when I was actually born there. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
It's interesting too. He was the professor of moral science.
Moral science, yes.
Oh,
I have no idea what that is, what the qualifications for that are.
Never realized morality was a science.
Well, I imagine I bet he had strong opinions about how people should behave, I would think.
Yes.
If I expanded this picture out and you saw his kids, you would probably agree with that.
He does look rather stern.
Yes, for sure. Now that was on my mom's side of the family. This is on my father's side of the family. This is the Reverend Charnock Allen Tharp. He's actually the great-grandfather of my great-grandfather who was killed by his daughter. He was a fairly influential Baptist minister in Georgia, in Dry Branch, which is just south of Macon. And his father founded the church, Vincent Allen Tharp. At some point, the next generation down, all the children's middle name was A. period, and it just became Tharp. But it started out as Allen Tharp. They think it's a Welsh name. They're not entirely sure. He looks very stern. He left a diary, which is available online, which I found at some point. And I thought that was, he was very anxious about the number of people he was bringing in, and the number of souls he was saving, and how he had good years and bad years. Not much discussion about the people he was enslaving, which was pretty substantial. He was had a cotton plantation. But he and his wife had
I think there must be an error in the date.
Oh, did I get something wrong?
Oh,
1870. I'm sorry.
In 1870.
No, that's supposed to be 1860. My apologies.
Oh.
Thank you for pointing that out. I did the spell check, but it doesn't do date check. Yeah.
Dang.
That's very good. Good catch. But they had 17 children, all of whom lived to adulthood.
Wow.
3 or 4 of the boys died in the Civil War. And I found out that even though this is on my Passmore side of the family, he officiated at a wedding on my Self side of the family. So his great-great-granddaughter married the great-great-grandson of a people he married back in Georgia. And they were basically, as far as I can tell, just passing through. They did not stay there more than a year or two. But his church was very popular. It was very big. His father's house is still standing. It's the oldest home in Twiggs County, Georgia. It was built in 1790.
Wow.
And I also ran across this article, the formation of evangelical communities in Middle Georgia, in one of the databases we have at work. You know, sitting at work on the reference desk, no one's asking me a question. I think I'll just throw a name into a database and see what pops out. And it's this really nice, 30 plus page article about his church, how it was gathered together. It's a big part of it is how before the Civil War, all the slaves could be members of the church itself as well. And they were in that church, and then some of the consternation involved when they split into separate Baptist associations during Reconstruction, when everything became more racially segregated. So it's an interesting read, and I thought it was pretty good. I've always thought he looks very, very stern, but apparently he had a lot of self-doubt himself about his not so much his abilities, but just his output as far as his influence on the Christian people around him. And but he was very active in his association. And there's a large article on him in this huge volume called Early Baptists of Georgia, which someone felt compelled to write. And my final one here is someone a little bit closer to home. This is my third great-grandfather, the Reverend John Spangler, who was born Johann Spangler. He was born in Germany and arrived in New Orleans at the age of 9 months with his parents. At some point, they ended up in Bastrop. I'm not sure if they then went from New Orleans to Galveston and then across land, or if they just went straight across from New Orleans. On their immigration document, they claimed to be planning to stay in Louisiana, but they clearly did not stay more than a year. They moved to Bastrop, and their their father died. And then their mother remarried a man named Stephen Jones, and they had another child. And then the mother died, and Stephen Jones remarried. So now all they had was stepfather. And it was, again, one of those situations where all the kids got farmed out again. There were 5 kids. 4 of them kind of hit the lottery. They ended up with fairly wealthy families in the Round Top area, northeast of LaGrange, one of whom's patriarch of the family was on the early board of Rudersville College, I found out recently. So I had that little connection with Southwestern, which was kind of nice. But my great-great-grandfather, or third great-grandfather, was the one that did not win the lottery. He ended up with a family that apparently treated him very, very poorly. I'm not entirely sure, but I think the man of the family was involved in the incident with all the people that were captured in Mexico, and they had the black bean incident. He was not in that group, but he was the guard back on the river for that. I'm not entirely sure. His name was Edward Marlowe, but I need to kind of confirm that it's the same Edward Marlowe. But his name is on the big monument to that up in LaGrange.
Wow.
So he ran away as a teenager, and the family story is he was just walking down the road, and a farmer passed him on a wagon, and he told him his story, and the farmer says, "Well, I need an extra hand at the house." What I think he really needed was a husband for his recently widowed daughter, who was about 5 years older than him. But they got married, had several children. She died fairly young. This is my third great-grandmother. And then he remarried and had another family as well. But he was a farmer, kind of bopped around South Central Texas as a Baptist minister as well. I will say, though, that the the document from New Orleans listed the name of the ship he was on. And so I plugged that name in. And the ship was called the Seth Spragg. And the Spragg family was a shipping family in New England. And they named a lot of the ships after boys and girls in the family. This ship was built in Maine in 1847, and they came across so the year he was born, it was like one of the very first sailings coming from Antwerp to New Orleans. And then at some point, I saw that it was actually used by the Union during the Civil War. And then at some point, it was sold to somebody in Australia. And it was renamed the Moonta. And at the archives of the South Australia State Library, so there is a photograph of the actual ship that brought my ancestor to Texas, which is really kind of cool. Now, this is years later, probably not too long before it stopped being used. But yeah, someone decided to take a picture of it. It ended up getting digitized, and I get to see it. So it's kind of a nice little connection. And that's a very global sense of history for something that's kind of, very close and kind of personal. He lived quite a long time. It's interesting to me. This is my grandfather's great-grandfather, and they lived right next to each other. He didn't die until my grandfather was over the age of 20, and never once talked about it. Didn't talk about him being a neighbor. This is the same grandfather that didn't like to talk about his mother either, so who knows what his issue was there. But
Maybe he just didn't like people.
yeah, that could very well be. Could very well be. So also the article there is from the Portal to Texas History. If you have any Texas history roots at all, I cannot recommend that site enough. It's basically a collection of digitized documents related to Texas. A lot of books, but mostly newspapers. And it's really, really handy to just put someone's name in. You need to try different, varieties of it. But if you know about where someone lived, you might be able to find a newspaper article. I found an article about my great-grandfather's chickens getting stolen and how they hadn't found the culprit yet. Another great-grandfather got bit by a rattlesnake, but is expected to recover. And, just odd little things like that kind of
Breaking news.
Exactly. Or how much my another grandfather got for wool prices for his sheep, which a knitter I thought was kind of cool to see that little wool connection. I had no idea that anyone raised wool in the family. So, kicking around these little sites like this, and we're such an advantage today where so much has been digitized and so much has been made available that you can find these things just with a little bit of snooping around. And I think that's the end of this section. Oh no, one more. I do have this picture. These are my fourth great grandparents, Joshua Adams and Temperance Smith Adams. They grew up in that same Cumberland Gap area of Tennessee and Virginia. And what's interesting about it is I actually found the records that one of the ministers kept of the church that they went to. It's called the Thompson Settlement Baptist Church. And it makes for very interesting reading. People were often denouncing each other, banning people, bringing them back in, getting mad at them again, including one gentleman who ratted on himself for drinking too much and getting angry. So he kicked himself out of church for a few months. And then he was brought back. But there's also in there the letter or the note that they had written a letter for this couple as kind of a letter of reference for when they wanted to join a church to where they were moving in Iowa. So, in another diary I found, relatives of theirs described the move. Several families moved at one time. They lived in the Cumberland Gap, and they basically built a raft and floated down to the Tennessee River, and then took the Tennessee River, which dips way down into Alabama and then back across Kentucky up to the Ohio River, floated down to the Missouri River, to the Mississippi, and then back up the Missouri till it got to Iowa. Almost the whole trip was done by boat, but they describe all the things that they saw along the way, like seeing trains for the first time. Super interesting story, I really think. And in his obituary, he lived to be about 94 or something like that, lived quite a while. And it mentioned the hymn that was played at his favorite hymn played at his funeral, which was written by Fanny Crosby, who I didn't know anything about. And if you can have a chance to look at a Wikipedia page about her, she was a very prolific hymn writer. She was blind, and was really widely known at the time. So that was one kind of a bit of personal history tied me back over to a broader history, which is those kinds of connections I really, really like to make. I have not been able to find out her background, though. With the last name Smith is never an easy thing to work with. And there were a lot of Smiths born in North Carolina who lived in that Cumberland Gap area. And I haven't been able to figure out which group she might be connected to. I keep hoping that I might find some sort of genetic genealogy connection, but that's getting pretty far back, and it's a little hard to find things like that. But I also like this picture that a cousin of mine found that actually they have this, what I assume is a Bible that's front and center in the middle of their family portrait. They both have their hands on it, which I think is kind of nice. It seems very stiff in kind of a way. I don't have the larger picture here, but all their children are standing around them. There were two daughters that I did not know which was which. I just knew the two daughters' names, and I didn't know who was who. I knew the grandfather. One of the sons was my great-grandfather. The other one must have been the other son. But by posting this online, a cousin chimed in and says, "Oh, my dad sent me this picture," and she said it was the exact same woman. She goes, "This is my great-great-grandmother, so I know that one is Mary Catherine." And so, mystery solved. So being willing to share that kind of information really helped me out quite a bit. And she had never seen this picture before, so it helped her out as well. I think that's the end for that section. I don't know if anyone else has any stories about that. I kind of centered it around ministers, but it really could have been about any. And I left many out. Some that were, just part-time ministers. I have a branch of the family that was Church of the Brethren, or Dunkards, that lived in Nebraska, which is kind of, a friend of mine described it as Mennonite light. So things that no one in my family really talked about very much. So, they just knew that they came down from Nebraska. And when they got here, there was an EUB church on the next farm over, and that's where they went. Okay, well, I'll share a little bit more with you. This is kind of more of the connection to history stuff that I find super interesting. It turns out a lot of these people are not the best people in the world, but I do have a family connection to them. And so they kind of have a soft spot in my heart, even though, I never knew them personally, and most people in my family didn't know them very personally. And when I started looking, I realized that all these people had Wikipedia pages. So if you want to find out more about them, you can take notes and take a look. But here's one of my favorite ancestors of all. This is my 11th great grandmother. Her name is Herodias Long. I think it's a feminine version of Herod. Puritan times.
What a terrible name to give a child.
To name their children.
Little Herod.
Yeah. She was born in England in around 1623. And, oops, did I freeze again?
No, you're okay.
Okay, I'm getting a thing that my connection's unstable. And she got married at the age of 14 or 15. Shortly afterwards, she and her husband moved to the New World. And they landed in Massachusetts at first, but at the time you had to join a congregation, and to join a congregation you had to pass certain kind of rules and behavior things, whether you were actually considered a citizen or a member of the plantation and all this kind of stuff. Well, they never passed any of those rules. So they moved on to Rhode Island, at which point they got crosswise with each other and split up. And it's believed that she and her husband were the first people granted divorce in Rhode Island by the governor himself. They were just causing so much trouble between the two of them, fighting and coming into court so much that pretty much it was the government that took things into their hands. And after the husband moved off to New York, he wrote back and said, "Can we please just end this now?"
Thank you for divorcing us.
Yes, yes, thanks. Then she moved in with someone else, ostensibly as his housekeeper or kind of a maid, but his wife left. She was not happy with the situation. And they had about 7 or 8 kids together. Not clear whether they actually ever got married. Then she left him and went to a third guy. And that third husband, which is John Porter, I'm descended from the Gardner husband, left most of his land to her kids by Gardner. They didn't have any kids together at that point. But one very interesting story about her is that she was friends with Mary Dyer, who was a very influential Quaker at the time. And she walked from Rhode Island to Weymouth to protest how her friend was being treated. And she got beaten and whipped and put in jail for 14 days. And she did all that with a baby. And then she walked all the way back. It's not clear that she ever became a Quaker, but she had strong opinions about things and how the world should work. And I kind of really admire her for that. And because she had so many children, and this was so long ago, she probably has tens of thousands of descendants. So she might be your great-grandmother too. It's hard to tell. Yeah, she was an interesting person.
That would be a great story to kind of hang on to, like about, that would be a really good female ancestor to have, you know?
She, at one point I read, she was the only, there's all these descendant societies in the United States. And a lot of them are based on, Mayflower descendants, but some of them are, descendants of a particular person, Jefferson descendants. And supposedly she was the only person, the only woman that had a descendants association.
Wow.
And it used to be very active in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, but I haven't been able to find much about it recently. So I don't know if it's still in existence, but it was at one point. Okay. This is her daughter-in-law's brother, Joshua Teft, who was involved in King Philip's War, which is kind of during that same period. And the Tefts lived near Narragansett land and were very close to Narragansetts and actually supposedly spoke Narragansett language. The Teft brothers did. But in trying to defend some of the Narragansetts during King Philip's War, they were charged with treason. And supposedly Joshua Teft is the only person ever drawn and quartered in the United States. Here's a little clip from a document that was written at the time. And it mentions something, oh yeah, I did mention, it's not on this document here, but somewhere else it says something about how he had not heard a sermon but once in 14 years, which was not a good thing in your defense at the time. But his story is very well documented. And so being able to find that connection and going back. Turns out I actually had a work colleague named Teft, and I'd never heard that name before. Then after she moved back to New York, I find this. And so I wonder if maybe we're somehow distantly related. But he's my 10th great granduncle, so it goes back pretty far. The next person on my list is, let's see. This is some person I never actually heard of at all. John Andrews Murrell. He's my first cousin, 7 times removed. He was the son of a Methodist minister, but he and his brothers were kind of the local bad boys in their community in Western Tennessee. And they got in trouble for stealing horses, but they would also entice slaves to run away with the promise of taking them to freedom and then sell them to other people. Yeah, really, really bad guys. But in the scheme of things, from what he was accused of later, kind of small potatoes as far as things go there. Not if you were the one being sold, I'm sure, but and there were several pamphlets that were written. Like a local kind of yellow journalist type guy comes through town and hears this story and decides there's money to be made here. So he writes a pamphlet about the Great Western Land Pirate, how he's the leader of a huge conspiracy against slaveholders, and now they're going to free slaves across the South, which, nothing makes slave owners more scared than the thought of something like that happening. And so they made up this giant rebellion that was supposed to take place. And anyone who was a stranger in town, especially if you were from the North, and it seemed to hit gamblers more than anything else, got in trouble. And apparently dozens of people were lynched across the South one spring because of this story built up about this ancestor that never actually took place. And I'd never heard this story, but there's many, many books about John Murrell, if you look up, and they tell different stories. They say his mother was a prostitute, which is, she ran an inn, not the same thing. He basically went to prison and got out, had tuberculosis, and didn't live much longer. Now, there's a museum in Nashville that claims to have his thumb, and they bring it out every Halloween. You can see his thumb, and it's got the H tattooed on it for horse thief. So, I don't know if it's actually his thumb or not, but it's a cool story. I don't think I want to see it, though. And I don't know why they removed his thumb. I have no idea why that would have happened. Here's someone you may remember if you've seen the movie Young Guns. Kiefer Sutherland played a character named Doc Scurlock. Well, he was the brother-in-law of my great-great-grandfather. If you remember earlier, my great-great-grandmother that was in the state hospital, her husband had a first wife. This Doc Scurlock was that first wife's brother. So he ran with Billy the Kid in New Mexico and all that. So, and I mentioned this at every family reunion, every Weaver Armstrong family reunion, and no one seems to be interested in it. I just think that's the coolest story. Mention Billy the Kid, and there's a movie tie-in, and
One of my ancestors, my grandfather's aunt's or mother, we have the legend that she danced with Jesse James.
wow.
Now, I don't know if that's true, but there you go.
There you go. It's the kind of thing that I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
And then I've got one more.
We have a legend in our family that
Yes, sir.
my great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were camping one night, and a couple of men rode up and they shared a meal and slept together, and they found out the next morning one of them was Jesse James.
Wow.
That Jesse James, he got around.
He got around.
That's right. That's right. And here's another notorious Texan that you may have heard of, is John Wesley Hardin. He also was the son of a Methodist minister. His son's a Methodist minister.
It's really hard to be a PK.
Yeah, PK was a tough gig in the 19th century. He lived up in Northeast Texas for a little while, which is kind of where my Self family moved, but they also moved down to Gonzales County, which is where my Self family moved as well. And there's several connections between the family. One is that he lived next door to the Passmores. This is the family where the daughters kill the fathers. And supposedly, my great-great-grandfather was shot at once because they were chasing John Wesley Hardin, and they wore the same color hat. And so they thought it was him as he was tearing by the house. But I just found out recently that the Hardin family papers are at Texas State University of San Marcos, and that they have letters written by my great-grandaunt Mary Self Smith. So I thought that was kind of a cool connection. My brother appreciates that the Selfs have a somewhat connection to the Hardin family, but I can't get anyone else interested in that either. But again, that's a local history. I mean, a larger history tying into local family history, which I think is really interesting. So those are all most of my stories. What little bit I have left is just kind of my best sources for genealogy. My aunts and uncles are always excellent stories. I would say my parents, but they've been gone for quite some time. My great aunt Joanne, who's still with us, my grandmother's oldest sister, youngest sister, but she's the only one from that generation still alive. She's a great source of stories. And every time I talk to her, she remembers something that I have never heard her say before, or she digs out a picture that I've never seen before. So talk to people who have stories, whether they're actually true or not. They give you something to kind of hang your research or your further looking on. My aunt told me the story about, I mentioned earlier, her great-great-grandmother from Indiana. She said that they came down south to look for land once, but went back. And she tells a story about she was in her teens and she assisted at a birth with a family they were traveling with, and the baby didn't survive. But she described the baby being so small that she could hold it in one hand. And then they went, and so my grandmother, my aunt remembered that story so well. And I thought, what were they doing in Arkansas? Well, years later, I find a list, and her father's brother, even though he died in Louisville, Kentucky, said he lived in Arkansas. So they may have been going to visit this brother. So this kind of offhand thing that my uncle rolled his eyes at, why were they going to Arkansas? There was probably some little nugget of truth to that. You just have to kind of keep an open mind and think, it may not be direct truth, but kind of come at it from the side. So definitely any family members that you can talk to, even cousins. My brother and I are always telling the different versions of the same story. He hears something totally different from the way I heard it, or he remembers it a different way. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. I mentioned earlier the Portal to Texas History digital newspaper project is so good. And I found that if you go to almost every state and just type in Idaho digital newspapers, California digital newspapers, there's these large initiatives, a lot of them started by the Library of Congress, where they've gone through and digitized newspapers. And you can just search for phrases and names through there, and I'm always really surprised. That's how I found that thing about the college in California. I never would have known about that otherwise.
I've used the Portal to Texas History to find a lot of stuff about First Methodist Church.
Oh yeah,
a lot
for
of
sure.
like amazing photographs and like articles and things like that just, you know, are passing things in a local newspaper, but that give you just a little bit of
Oh yeah,
tidbit enough of information that like helps you then like take the next step. So,
right. It might name a sister-in-law, or you
right.
might find an old obituary or something. Yeah, it's always really interesting. Chronicling America is the Library of Congress's national version of the digital newspapers, and I find that really interesting. They've also buildings. They have many, many photographs of historic buildings that might have a tie-in. I found pictures of a ranch out near San Angelo that had a kind of a slight tie-in to the family, and to be able to kind of just visit that digitally is really, really helpful. I love all those kinds of free sources. Now there's pay sources like that require you to subscribe, like Ancestry, which I do use and find useful, but it kind of irks me a little bit that you're paying to build your own content kind of thing. And although there's value added to what they provide, I think you can go a long way by just using some of the free sources that are out there. I also had an uncle that was, via his marriage to my Aunt Eve, was a member of Latter-day Saints. He actually started with me with a lot of the documentation that I have, because he did a lot of the legwork back in the day before, you know, any kind of internet type sources were available. And so that gave me a good leg up. And definitely familysearch.org is their records website. It's free. You may have to create an account for it, but it is free. But those Latter-day Saint sources are really, really useful too.
Some of these sources are also available through Awesome Public Library, like
Yes.
Heritage Quest, which
Yes.
will do your census search, is really pretty good. And we have access to that for the APL. So.
Yeah, for sure. And then my final slide here is just some of the things I've probably been talking about all the way through is, you know, be open to the family stories and just pay attention to all the strange things that people tell you, because there may be something that gives you a clue or a hint to kind of move on. Official documents will contradict each other. I had a great-great-grandfather who every census would switch between whether he was born in Massachusetts or New York. Massachusetts, he would just change it. And he may not have been the person reporting it. It may have been his wife, it may have been one of his kids. So, you know, the preponderance of the evidence is often a way that genealogy kind of works. But again, there's no exact truth unless you've got, an entry in a phone book can almost have more truth to it than maybe a birth record, for instance. It all depends. And there's no prize for being right. Just trying to find out as much as you can is the goal, for me anyway. I love the fact that I can participate in genetic genealogy work. It can be an eye-opener and it can be a shocker. So I found out a few things, not about my direct family, but some cousins and stuff that I'm kind of like, I've got some questions, and that I probably will never ask because it's not that important. These are people I love and care about, and that just doesn't really matter. But and the final thing I would mention is just to be generous with what you find. If you find pictures and see if you can get them scanned or take photographs of them and send them around. I recently connected with a second cousin of my dad's, who had a lot of family pictures that I had never seen before. And she's been very generous sharing them with me. And because of who she was the daughter of a daughter of a daughter, she tended to get more stuff than some other people might. Caroline had said earlier how she was kind of the collector of the stuff. Make yourself the reputation as the person who's the collector of the stuff, and stuff will just flow your way. My uncle, every 6 months or so, sends me a package of stuff. He goes, "Who are these people?" And I'm like, "Oh boy," because I get a stack of obituaries from Indiana that were clipped out of the paper 100 years ago that got stuffed in a Bible somewhere, and he has no idea who they are, and I know exactly who they are because I've been looking. So definitely share what you find with other people because they will be very, very grateful, and it will help them tell their stories as well.
Stephen, I have some Bibles that I would like to share. I don't have a specific individual who might be interested. Is there a website you would recommend posting them on?
That's a really good question. I know there is a website for that, for family photos. I've seen that before.
Would the Mormon Church take it?
What's that?
Would the Mormon Church be interested?
They might be. They might very well be.
I know I could put it on my own chart on Ancestry, but
that's a great.
Maybe I should put it in 2 places.
Well, if you put it in Ancestry, that would go a long ways. As long as it's people can search on it and find it. I found many scanned Bible pages that way that that some fourth cousin has, but I'm interested in it because it's just as much mine as theirs. It just traveled through that family name. But yeah, I would check with them and see. I don't know that there's a website specifically for family Bibles though. But if you've got that,
someplace where other people can find it is what I want.
Right. Yeah. I've put a lot of things on. I don't know if people use it as much anymore, but it was a photography site called Flickr. And I scanned a bunch of pictures from a box, put it in there, and tagged them Buffalo County, Nebraska. So that people were looking for photographs of Buffalo County, Nebraska, they might stumble across it. And as I figure out who the people are, I put their names on it. So that'd be another way to maybe do that. Flickr doesn't behave like it did when I first set up my account years ago, so that may not be the best bet. But any place where you can store photographs online and it's searchable by other people, that'd be a way to go. But if you've got an Ancestry site and you're making that stuff available to other people, I think that'd be really helpful.
And do you have a recommendation for family tree software? What do you use?
That's a really good question. I used to use something called the Master Genealogist. It doesn't exist anymore. The guy who was running it stopped running it. So then I got a version that you can make your own website with, something called the Next Generation Genealogist. And it's complicated. And so I find I don't use it as much. What I mostly have been using is just my Ancestry site, which shame on me. I mean, that means it's kind of hidden from a certain group of people that it's not available out there. I'd like to have something a little bit more publicly available. But as far as standalone on my own computer, I don't actually have anything right now. I'm still looking, trying to find something that I think will work. But I wish I had a better answer for you.
My mother used Family Tree Maker, which, you know, is pretty good. It goes along with ancestry.com. It's one of those that's sort of linked with that. I have a Mac version of something, I think that's just called Leaf. But I think, you know, in that way, like the designer died and like, I don't think there's any updates to it. So I don't know what the newest software kind of is, but I do know that ancestry.com is kind of, you know, become this giant conglomerate that takes in everything. So
it's hard to know what to do. I mean, I had Family Tree Maker for a long time, and you know, it's still on my computer somewhere, but it kept having to be updated and this and that. And I find that I don't use it anymore. I just use Ancestry. And I have you know, blogging is sort of not the thing that people do these days. People do, you know, other things, but I find that my family history blog will occasionally draw, you know, someone who's just typed in a name, and then they will see something there. Like I have all the scanned pages of a family Bible there, and, or, you know, you know, all those things. So I occasionally find some information, you know, where somebody just drops by. I wanted to say something, Stephen, when you first started and you were talking about, this had me kind of thinking about the spiritual, right, aspect of all of this. And you were saying about that you wanted everyone to be remembered. And I found that that's one of the most, the things that I've enjoyed the most. My mother's, the first child in my grandmother's, that my grandmother had died when he was 5 as a result of the complications of measles. And he doesn't have a head, I mean, it was the Depression. They had left their town to go to another town to try to find work. That's where he got sick. That's where he died. And I researched him and found so much, being able to tell his story was really beneficial. And just picking up the phone or emailing people, I found so much information. Like I discovered that the service was done by the Salvation Army. And I searched for Salvation Army in the town where they were, and found out that there was a museum there. And I sent an email, and this lovely person answered my email and sent me information about what a religious service may have been like for him.
Oh, wow.
Done, what hymns they might have sung, probably sung, who the minister there was at that time, and his wife and their daughter. And I was able to add all of this dimension to it that I would never have known. And both of my grandparents' response to that death, my grandfather had a mental breakdown, went to a sanitarium for a while. My grandmother never talked about the son and was always, we just have to go on. And you could just see how all of this had something to do with the people that I knew them to be. And I recently did another one with someone who died from the flu in 1918, and ended up with a whole series and learned so much about the military and all of that. And another time was able to tell some cousins about their father, things they didn't know about him. And I just got a line from a Christmas letter where his wife just wrote, well, despite his back surgery in July, he was able to attend the March on Washington in August. And I went, what? And find out all of these things about him. He was the presbyter of the Synod of Maryland, of Baltimore, and was very involved in the civil rights movement. And these are my dad's cousins. They're like, oh, I didn't know he did that. Well, I was in high school. I didn't listen to their stories around the table. Oh, I'd already left home. So to me, that's part of the spiritual aspect of genealogy is giving a story to someone who has no descendants, especially someone who died young, but not necessarily that. And finding out those bits that other people in the family, it gives them something that they didn't know about too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great story. Yeah, that's kind of my motivator for a lot of things. It's just, there's the uncle that everybody knows because he was loud and maybe a little bit notorious or got into trouble or something like that. But he had brothers and sisters, and even the quiet ones have something to share and contributed to the family. And yeah, well, I'm glad you kind of think of it that way. That's for me. It's like it's not just counting the number of people that were in a family. You want to see how they interacted, how they connected, and it's just like stories that my grandmother talks about her sister going off to work in Fort Worth, and it was very scandalous. They lived in Abilene, and she went off to work by herself in the big city. And she was her big sister that she kind of looked up to. And when she came back at Christmas, she brought her some little plastic beads or something as a necklace. Because it was during the Depression, they had no money. And it was her absolute favorite Christmas present ever. And this was an aunt that lived up in Kentucky. I didn't know her very well, but I always had a soft spot in my heart for her because of how my grandmother felt about her and how much she appreciated all she had done for her. So, yeah.
And I found that on days when I'm brave and I pick up the phone or I email someone, you just never know who's going to help you. I was looking up the guy who was, drafted into the army and for World War I, and saw that he went to some camp. And when I Google it, I see that there's some guy who does talks on this camp. He does all this research. So I send him an email. He calls me on the phone and tells me all the information, about this camp there and how many, and just, so some people have a very generous spirit. And if you just, I'm kind of a shy person, so, I don't always want to call or email, but
Same here, yeah.
sometimes people will really help you out when there's no documents that really give you that information.
Well, and that finding the lost person, there is such a, I don't know, that's such a triumph in this way that we lose an individual, and then if you can like figure out where they were, I in my historical research have tracked down the sister of the woman writing the diary to her sister, and it was a real moment when I sort of discovered where her grave was and that I had found her, and she didn't have children and her brothers died in the Civil War and she died in 1864, and, her sister had died. And so like that whole family just like died off. But somehow knowing that like, where she was, that I could go visit that grave if I wanted to. And she's not related to me except her family story is like essentially also my family story coming to Texas. I mean, there is this way in which you become part of this historical migration that's particularly important. And you understand the sort of complexity of history and the complexity of humanity in a very different way, that I think, helps us spiritually go, well, nobody's perfect and nobody, we're all really complicated, and this is not a new thing that we're all really complicated. Karen, you posted in White Too Long, Robert Jones' Challenging Meditations. I would also say Slaves in the Family, and I can't remember Charles Ball's book. I think he won a Pulitzer Prize.
That's really good book.
His family had a very large plantation in South Carolina, I think it was, and thousands of slaves. And he traced that ancestry to sort of own it. And that was really important. Those things are kind of important to remember too. And in my family history, my grandmother, kept saying things like, oh, we're just poor dirt farmers, we're poor dirt farmers, as a kind of like reference to class. And it turns out my mom traced the ancestors, and they weren't poor dirt farmers. They actually had and this is not, savory, they had a plantation in Georgia that was burned. Were they wealthy? I don't know. That depends, like it depends on what you mean by wealthy. They were wealthy enough to own at least 10 slaves. They lost everything in the war and moved to Arkansas. And from Arkansas, they moved to Texas. And that is my great grandfather, who was shot at Antietam and wounded, and always kind of held his arm in a certain kind of way. And but on the other side of my family, in this interesting way, my grandfather's great grandfather was a Union soldier. And so that Confederate soldier's granddaughter married a Union soldier's granddaughter and a grandson. And that puts us all together here in Texas in this very interesting way. And now my brother wears a beard and he looks exactly like Titus Wise, his sister. Dude, you are really related to those people.
One of the things Jones says is that he always told himself that, oh, well, my family didn't have dozens and dozens of slaves, so surely this weight isn't very heavy for me. And then he found out that the price of a healthy, particularly male, but even a female slave could be worth as much as it costs to buy a house to live in. So even if your family only had 1 or 2 or 3 slaves, it's an enormous financial asset. And I found it very interesting and personally challenging to read that book and engage with myself over what implications should it have for my life that my ancestors had these attitudes and that my family has had this kind of advantage because of the economic contributions of enslaved people. So I highly recommend it.
And I think it's really important when all of us are willing to sort of say, there's a certain amount of shame attached to that. And there shouldn't necessarily be, because our ancestors were all in history and they were not perfect. And it's important to sort of remember that this was a widespread social problem and this was socially acceptable. Just as today, there are things that we socially accept today, and we recognize that probably we will eventually go, wait a minute, that's not exactly right.
Yeah, I think it's useful to draw a line between shame and guilt on the one hand,
right,
and responsibility
right,
on the other. I don't feel shame and I have no guilt. On the other hand, do I have a certain responsibility to do some things or not do some things?
Well, and there's a responsibility to recognize that that's our history. I think that's really important to say, no, wait a minute, this is a really long-standing historical problem, So other thoughts? Stephen, I just loved your presentation. I could talk with you for hours.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.
Thank you.
I hope it helped. I felt a little strange that it was all just about me, but
No, it's awesome.
everyone has the same stories, has similar stories out there, similar connections.
And I know you listed a lot of the free stuff. Is Ancestry the one if you were going to do something?
Well, if you wanted to build your own family tree and make connections to a lot of records, that's a good place to go. But it is kind of a steep. It's like every 6 months. It's like $100 or something like that.
There are various.
You can have a free account. You can try it out for free. Before I ever started paying, I did a free account, I don't know, 3-4 times, and it accepted my login. But every time they would say, oh, free trial, I would get back on for 6 weeks or whatever. So you can, do a short-term free trial before you, spend the money.
And I would really agree with Stephen about be open to what you discover, because there are you can discover some really amazing things that like disprove like historical, nostalgia. Like, women never did X, and then you sort of find 57 people in your family that did exactly that thing. And or you uncover some deep family secret or some deep family shame, and then you kind of wonder like, well, why have we been hiding that thing? And that's makes us sort of like remember those things about what it's like to be a human being, is like people's lives are really complicated, and we sort of have to remember that's something. We like to sort of think, oh, like life is really easy if you follow a certain number of steps, and it turns out no, that it's not at all what happens. Are there any other last questions or anything that you would like to ask?
I have one more, and it's about ancestry policy. I have a couple of nieces who are very busy with their careers right now, who appear to be the only ones, really interested in family history. What I'm wondering is, if I put all this stuff on Ancestry, after I die, will it still be on Ancestry? Could somebody go back, say, maybe my granddaughter, when she's my age, will she still be able to search the stuff I put on Ancestry? Assuming Ancestry's still around.
Well, that's a good question. If you keep the account going, you can get someone to pay for it and, pass the password down. I don't suppose not. But I actually don't know. Now, what you can do is you can copy a family tree, and you can like download the GEDCOM, the machine readable version of the file, and keep it locally, and then someone else could upload it. It might not keep all those connections to all the records that are in there. They're proprietary, census connections and connections to pictures. Those may all go away, but the tree itself would actually be there. And they could maybe.
I think there is a way that you can make that public, because I've searched other people's and found public information. And it's really, I think it's about how you set up the account. I think the general practices don't like give information that's like people who are still living. But
Yeah,
I think
mine
those things can be made
does
public.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine's set up so that if someone's still living, I can see it, but nobody else can.
Right. Yeah.
You have the option to make your tree either public or private. And I keep mine private because I make mistakes. And there are lots of trees that are public with lots of wrong information. And, so-and-so had a baby after they died, and crazy stuff. People lived in 3 states in the same, whatever. So I keep mine private. And even if it's private, you can invite people who can look at your tree and who can share information with you on your tree. So you can invite other people in your family, and they're able to view your tree right now while you're alive and contribute to it. You can set if they can just look at it, or if they can contribute to it.
I've heard the same question about Facebook, but I don't know, Karen, what the answer was of what happens to all of that stuff. Does it get
I think with
deleted?
like Facebook, you can designate an heir to your digital
An
account.
heir?
I don't know if Ancestry does that or not, though. That's a good question.
They should, considering what they're all about.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd think so.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really, really